Hey everybody, this is Rod Meldon, the Book of Mormon Evidence Guy, and I'm here with David Reed from Michigan, who is a judge, and he has been doing some really amazing research on DNA involving the Book of Mormon. As you know, for many years that was kind of my first foray into Book of Mormon geography research, was this DNA research, and I was kind of involved with what it was early on, which was mostly mitochondrial DNA.
Mm-hmm.
David has done some additional really phenomenal research involving other types of DNA, and shows how all of it actually
Yeah.
combines together to have a really powerful.
And obviously,
Yeah.
as you know, you're the one that it was your information that got me interested in. My mother gave me your DVD, and I was looking at it. It was the DNA evidence one, and as I went through it, and I was like, I wonder what the information really shows. I wanted to see it for myself, so I just started as a hobby, started looking into that DNA evidence. As I started getting into it deeper and deeper, I started thinking, oh, there's additional information here that needs to get out. So
Yeah.
that's how I got into
Well,
it.
just for full disclosure, I am not a geneticist by profession, and neither is David.
Mm-hmm.
But we both are very passionate about this information, and you don't have to be a geneticist to be able to quote from the peer-reviewed scientific journals, which is so.
Yeah.
So we don't. I don't rely on me. I don't say trust me because I'm a geneticist. Okay, I said trust the information because it's coming from mainstream scientific sources.
Right. And both, you are a scientific researcher.
Yes.
For me, I was a patent attorney. As a patent attorney, you have to be able to research and understand the technology in lots of different areas. So you have to become able to deal with that scientific literature. But I'm not saying that I'm a geneticist or have done the research myself. It is more in going through the scientific literature and the peer-reviewed literature. You have to dig through it a little bit sometimes to go through the data.
Yeah.
To get away from what how it gets messaged by other people. But the information is there, and then you can gather it. And it's actually, there's some very good DNA evidence that people aren't aware of. So I'm glad we get a chance to talk about it.
Exactly. So kind of, I'm not going to go on a big recap of the DNA research that I did. I did 15 years ago. I released a video, well, a set of DVDs basically that had about a 2-hour presentation on DNA. We're not going to go through all 2 hours of that. So if you'd like to refer back to that, there's ways you can get a hold of the DVD set, or I think we're going to put some of that up on our streaming website and possibly on YouTube as well. But just kind of an overview for those who are not aware of the issues that are taking a look at. So this was several years ago, and all of a sudden I started hearing rumblings that DNA disproves the Book of Mormon. I think a lot of people have already heard my story as far as what happened with that, and how I just wanted to find out, well, is there an answer? I mean, I know the Book of Mormon is true from a spiritual standpoint, but because I know it's true spiritually, there's going to be,
the evidence
physical
has to be
evidence.
there, right?
Yes, exactly.
Truth is truth. If it's true, the evidence is going to show up. So
exactly. So that's when I began doing a research study on DNA in the Book of Mormon, and really kind of just to break it down in just a second. We can kind of both toss in here information, but essentially the problem is this, and that is that when they began sequencing DNA from Native American populations here in the Americas, they were finding they were primarily Asiatics, and meaning that and they actually were part of one of really 4 different primary, what they call founding haplogroups. Now, a haplogroup, there's supergroups, kind of the larger group, and then there's subgroups, and there's subgroups called clades. Yeah. And there's subgroups, yeah. Even some of them.
You could just view them as families, so a grouping of DNA. So,
exactly. Yeah. And so when it comes down to it, there's actually 3 different primary supergroups. Basically, if you want to put them in by region, it's essentially what were the Europeans, and then there's the Africans, and then there's the Asians.
Yeah, they have distinct markers that are different.
Yeah, and that differentiate basically the 3 groups there, and the problem basically, maybe kind of explain the problem would actually one of the best ways we could probably do that is actually show a little video
Okay.
that actually demonstrates the problem. So there was a German reporter, and actually we're just going to let the video tell the
Okay.
story here. Okay.
The foreign press was given a rare opportunity to interview the leaders of Utah's dominant religion. Gordon B. Hinckley is the current president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and is believed by his followers to be a modern-day living prophet. It was in just such an interview that in January 2002, a German reporter asked President Hinckley about the DNA evidence facing his religion.
What will be your position when DNA analysis will show that in the history never ceased an immigration from Israel to the North America? It could be that the fact is
It hasn't happened. That hasn't been determined yet. All I can say is that's speculating. No one really knows that, the answer to that, not at this point.
And with that, it was kind of very interesting, that whole exchange there, because you can almost see on President Hinckley's face that he's a little perturbed by the
Right.
question, because we don't have a really good answer.
Yeah.
But it turns out that what his statement was actually prophetic,
Yeah.
because that was in 2002. It wasn't until about 2003 when articles began coming out in scientific journals like American Journal of Physical Anthropology and Science and Nature and so forth, addressing the DNA issue.
Yeah, and I love that he took the right attitude towards it, right? So at that, as you said, at that particular point in time, the initial evidence coming in was showing solely Asiatic origins for Native Americans. And President Hinckley, he's not a scientist, but he takes the exact right approach, which is that, wait a second, that hasn't happened yet, that hasn't been determined yet. And I that's really the approach that we should take, right? To give it some time and have confidence and faith that things will work out. And sure enough, over time, as you know, the DNA evidence then started to come out. Like you said, I think it was an inspiration there to wait and give it some time.
Yeah. Now I failed to actually mention what the video was. So that video clip was actually from a documentary video called DNA versus the Book of Mormon, which was really pretty devastating. There were literally, I don't know exactly what numbers, but I'm guessing in the hundreds of thousands of members of the church who had their testimonies really deeply challenged, because DNA is something that's used in a court of law.
Right.
It's not something you can fake or really mess around with.
Right.
Although DNA studies can take the data and then try to interpret the data in different ways, and we're going to talk about that in just a little bit when we talk about dating of the DNA. But this is a profound problem. So essentially, just to put it in a nutshell, when they started sequencing DNA from Native Americans who were thought to be remnants of the Book of Mormon, that they had all Asiatic DNA types, and Lehi and his family, were they Asians? No, they were Hebrews. They came down to Shem line. So you have really, by the way, the three supergroups are interesting because they actually match up with what the Bible talks about with Noah and the sons of Noah.
Yeah, can I add just one thing though?
Yes.
So all of this sort of, as you know, so going into the DNA, they already had a paradigm, which was that, the mainstream science had a paradigm that the Americas were populated, coming over the Bering Land Bridge and that kind of thing.
Exactly.
So they had an expectation of what kind of DNA they were going to see. And so when they were testing it and they're saying it's all Asiatic in origin, it all fits that paradigm, they were actually, at times when they'd have something else pop up, they would assuming that, well, that must be an error, it must be contamination from a researcher or something like that. So they were kind of, it wasn't that was the only thing they ever saw. It was that was the only thing that was being accepted as being distinct. Yeah.
Yeah, which actually it's surprising about that. People who actually do science, they realize that these kinds of things happen. People who are outside the scientific field kind of feel like that it's just pure, whatever the data is, it is. But there's a lot of interpretation and understanding of different things and different biases even that are placed, because scientists are like everyone else. They're human beings and they have their different ideas and they look through different lenses. So just because it's scientific doesn't necessarily mean that it's actual 100% factual.
Right.
So a couple of quick things. So the conclusion basically of this DVD was that if the DNA shows the Book of Mormon is not true, and the church is based on the Book of Mormon, then the church is not true, and that's their essentially, in a nutshell, that's what they're saying. So when I started doing the DNA research, I began looking at these articles that began again coming out in like 2003 and 2000 and after that time frame. And one of the questions that people have is, what do we really know about the actual ancestry of Lehi and his family? So I think we can say a few things. Number one is we know that they came down through the lineage of Shem. So Noah had 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Japheth was blessed by Noah that his seed would exceed all, and they became the Asiatic peoples of the earth. And of course, there are more Asian people on the earth now today than any other of the 3 type of the 3 sons. And then the other one was Ham, who married Egyptus, and Egyptus had the lineage of Cain, according to biblical sources, had the lineage of Cain in her. So that's how basically Cain's seed made it through Noah's flood. And then the last one was Shem, and Shem was blessed with the priesthood. And it was through his line that we have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and so forth, which in the Book of Mormon, Lehi, when they got the brass plates, he went back and he said, "Oh, we are direct descendants of Joseph of Egypt," and that's Shem's line. So what we do know about Lehi's family is that they're not the Asiatic people, and they're not the African people. They're basically the European, or what we call Middle Eastern people.
Right. Well, at least you would have an expectation, right? Because you know from the brass plates that Lehi's family, that Lehi is through the line of Joseph. We know from the scriptures Joseph's ancestry to some extent. So you don't necessarily know all of the people that could have contributed to Lehi's line,
right.
But nevertheless, you should have an expectation of the types of DNA that you might see.
Right, and then the other thing is that what about Ishmael?
Yeah,
because we don't even know Ishmael's wife's name. I mean, we have very little information about Ishmael, but we do know this about Hebrew and Jewish populations, and that is that they were actually instructed by the Lord to not marry outside of their kindred, which kind of is a combination of their same belief systems, but also their basic genetic ancestry. Mm-hmm. And so they have a tendency not to intermarry outside of those groups, especially back in those days. And so I think we can say that there's a high probability. Really, that's what we're talking about here, is probabilities.
Right.
Because the only way we can have an absolute factual, this is the way it is if we were able to somehow get a sample, from Lehi or Sariah or Ishmael or his wife, somebody who was actually, part of that, of the voyage coming here to America. And we don't have that.
Right.
So the best we can do is say, okay, what are the probabilities?
Right.
And so that's one of the things that we're going to be talking about here. So what do we know then as far as the founding lineages? Well, we know that they were Hebrews. Hebrews have some specific markers. They're part of a separate supergroup. So we can kind of eliminate the 2 other supergroups as being really a contender for being their ancestors, and if we go all the way back to we did kind of I would go all the way back to Noah in that time frame. So as far as a few things that we know, as far as we know that the 10 tribes of Israel were taken captive by the Assyrians around 722 BC, and Lehi and his family were still there in Jerusalem area around 600 BC. And so I think if is there some way that we can find out what were the primary lineages that were in Jerusalem at the time of Lehi?
Right. Yeah, and that's some of the things that you had done early on, was looking at some of the DNA that is found there in those locations. Yeah.
Yeah. And so when we go through that DNA of what was there, this is what was fascinating for me. So just as just a really quick overview. So I was looking at mitochondrial DNA, which is DNA which is essentially passed on from mothers to all of their offspring, but only their female offspring will pass it on to their next generation. So it's a continuous link of mothers to mothers to mothers to mothers to mothers.
Right.
And so that gives us that's a little bit easier than you have autosomal DNA, when you have the male and the female both. I mean, each generation, their chromosomes are going to be half from the mom and half from the father, and so it gets diversified very, very quickly just in a couple of generations. But the reason why they use the mitochondrial DNA is because that's a continuous maternal line. Okay, now you're going to be talking about Y chromosomal DNA,
right,
which is the opposite as far as it's the father's line. So all the way, so it's your father's father the other direction. Okay, and that research had not really been done 15 years ago when I did the mitochondrial DNA, because they felt like that was the most likely to give some better information about things like population movements and dating of when those things happen and when different people showed up at different places around the earth. So that's when I was doing the Y chromosomal, or excuse me, the mitochondrial DNA dating. Okay, so with that being said, the basic issue was that there's no mitochondrial DNA in the Americas that match up with Hebrew populations. And then what we started finding out is that there began to be some interesting publications that started coming out that said that they found a new haplotype. So there's haplogroups A, B, C, and D that were initially done, and those were all Asiatic. So haplogroup A was primarily in the Aleutians up in Alaska. Haplogroup B was kind of in the southwestern part of the United States primarily, and haplogroups C and D were throughout all of North and South America. And the markers of those groups all show that Asiatic populations today have the same markers. They were absolutely Asian, and that was really where the whole controversy stemmed from, because Lehi and his family are not Asians, so they're Hebrews. But so where's the Hebrew DNA? Where is there any indication that there were Hebrews who came here to the Americas? Because it looked like at the time when this German reporter was interviewing President Hinckley, that there was nothing except for Asiatic DNA.
Yeah. Can I just stop you right there for just a second? So that's where you were. That's where the view was. For example, when with the President Hinckley thing came, they had seen the A, B, C, D, the mitochondrial DNA, all looked Asian. I would note that since that time, mitochondrial, the DNA, the B and the C, it's just some of the more recent things that I've looked at. Yeah. They actually tend to be more in the heartland type area than the percentages they have elsewhere in the Americas. So just the possibility that even though they were initially viewed as Asian, and they are of Asian origin, but nevertheless, there was a little bit of their occurrence over in the potential regions where Lehi would come from as well. There was a little bit as well. So kind of more of a Central Asian as opposed to a Far East Asian on some of those. Okay. But nevertheless, that's just my little addition there.
That's good, because we get it. Yeah. I mean, this has been 15 years and there's been a ton of information that's come out since then.
But without a doubt, the mitochondrial A, B, C, and D, mainstream sciences accepts them as Asiatic origin. And
So one of the first, when I started begin doing the research, one of the first things that really kind of caught my eye or my attention was an article actually came out in the journal Science, which we know Nature is the biggest one in Europe, and Science is kind of the biggest here in the United States. And there was an article that came out in April of 1998, And it said something that was really fascinating. It says anthropologists have long assumed that the first Americans who crossed into North America by way of the Bering Strait were originally Asians. But recently they have been puzzled by surprising features on a handful of ancient American skeletons, features that resemble those of Europeans rather than Asians. They said this new data from a genetic marker called lineage X. So they had A, B, C, D, and all of a sudden they jumped all the way to X because they're like, where's this coming from? Suggest a definite, if ancient, link between Eurasians and Native Americans, says Theodore Shull, a molecular anthropologist from Emory University in Atlanta. Now a new genetic study may link Native Americans and people of Europe and the Middle East. So this was kind of the first little crack in the dam, if you will, that maybe there's somebody here besides Asians. Okay, and in fact, then in this article, it talked about confirmed haplogroup X has been found in Europe. It's been found in Finland and in Italy and in Israel and in Turkey and Bulgaria. So this haplogroup X is definitely a European lineage, right? Interesting, it was found in Israel. Yeah, that's kind of a fun one. And then just a year after that, there was another article that just came out. This is in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology in 1999. And it says, curiously, this haplogroup X is found in modern populations of both Europe and Southwest Asia, but not in Central Siberia, which is now regarded as the source for the peopling of the New World. So that
was a big shock when they didn't find X in Eastern Asia and in eastern parts of Siberia.
The Asiatic people don't have the 5 markers that indicate the X lineage on the mitochondrial DNA. So all of a sudden there was this A, B, C, D, and X. And X it confirms its legitimacy as a founding haplogroup. So there's 5. Is that still accurate today as far as mitochondrial DNA? There's 5 primary lineages.
Yes.
A, B, C, D, and X. So X is the only one that's not Asian.
Correct.
And it is actually European.
Yeah. Well, you know how things go. Things get a little nuanced. So and you'll get into this because when they didn't see haplogroup X in Eastern Asia and in the eastern parts of Siberia, it was kind of like, okay, where did this come from then? And there's this looking for where it originated, and we'll get to that. But I lost the train of thought beyond that. But yeah, so that was an issue there. So now currently, as you know, and we'll get to, there are some people who will still say haplogroup X is Asian. But there's no evidence that puts it in Eastern Asia. It's clearly the Middle East, and those that are focusing on that have found that. But just so you know, that there are people out there that'll still say that it's Asian, but that's based off of the prior paradigm. They're not letting go of that.
Well, and part of that had to do with Genghis Khan.
Yeah.
Because when he did his rampage up through the Asiatic areas and so forth, they left quite a bit of their seed, if you will, along the way, strewn along the path. But I actually have there's articles that have come out that said that it's not related to the Altai, which is the
Altai region.
Altai,
yeah. There's a place called the Altai region. It's in Siberia, but it's sort of central. It's not eastern, so it's like a couple thousand miles maybe from the Bering Land area, and that does have a little bit of haplogroup X.
Yes.
And so there was a little bit of a burst of, well, maybe that's where it came from. Yeah. But when they actually sequenced it and looked at it, it's not the closest relative of the Native Americans, and it's not the origin. Yeah.
So a couple of other quick things, because people are familiar with like U.S. News and World Report. So in 2001, this is just a year before President Hinckley took the stage with the German reporter during the Winter Olympics. And this is really fascinating because it says Wallace's, this is the researcher, his newest and most surprising discovery is a set of genetic markers found only in the Ojibwa and other tribes living near the Great Lakes. The markers are not found in any other Native Americans or in Asia. We just don't know how it got there, Wallace says, but it's clearly related to the European population. The simple answer would be that the DNA arrived with European colonists, but the strain is different enough from existing European lineages that it must have left the Old World long before Columbus.
Right.
So this is not something that was a more recent admixture, of Europeans coming over and mixing with the Indians and so forth. This is actually before Columbus, and he's going, oh,
Right.
so how did this European DNA get here before Columbus?
Right.
And that was one of the big things. And then this one is actually in 2002. Now this is right about the same time as President Hinckley had this interview. This is from the American Journal of Physical Anthropology. And in this one, they said, this is what it says. It says, we identified a prehistoric individual, and you're going to get into this in a lot more detail here in a few minutes because they're talking about the same guy here. But this was initially in 2002. It was radiocarbon dated to 1,340 years, plus or minus 40 years before present. So that puts it about what? About 300 AD.
Yeah, so that's an interesting one because obviously they're talking about Kennewick Man, and so in my book, Face of a Nephite, this here is Kennewick Man that people, Kennewick Man was a skeleton. This is the Smithsonian did a recreation based off of the skeleton, and this is recreation done by the Smithsonian for Kennewick Man, and he was haplogroup X, and so then the question is well, when he came over, and we'll get into that later.
Yeah, we will.
And as to whether, I mean, mostly the mainstream science, well, now they'll commonly say 9,000 years ago.
Yeah.
But the carbon dating,
and we're going to show you how the dating has bounced all over the place, and so you can't just automatically assume just because it gives a date that is the actual final answer,
right?
Because there's lots of things that go into this. We're going to get into the details on that because that is really the only thing that is keeping the haplogroup X DNA from being directly related to the Book of Mormon and its migrations.
Right, because their argument is that, well, Kennewick Man, if he was haplogroup X, if he was 9,000 years ago, obviously that would mean that it's in the Americas before the Book of Mormon timeframes, and as we'll get into, I think he actually was in Book of Mormon timeframes.
Yeah. But this initial thing was basically 1,340 years ago before present. The member of haplogroup X found in the Columbia River in Vantage, Washington. The presence of haplogroup X in a prehistoric North American skeleton confirms the hypothesis that haplogroup X is a founding lineage. It says this verifies a prehistoric presence of haplogroup X in North America. And when I first saw this, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is pretty profound. This is a big thing, right? Because they're saying it's not just Asians. There was this one group, but they weren't all over the Americas. Okay, in fact, this is evolutionary anthropology. This is the year after President Hinckley. Okay, so this is when it started to really unfold in the DNA side. It says haplogroup X is evolutionary anthropology in 2003. Haplogroup X has now been found in 2 individuals from a 700-year-old cemetery in west central Illinois. Okay, as the sequences are virtually identical to those of modern Algonquins from the Great Lakes region and confirmed to be members of haplogroup X. So basically, the Algonquin people who are there today are in fact directly related to these 2 individuals that are in a 700-year-old cemetery, which pushes it back before Columbus.
And since then, there's been additional findings that put it right back around within 100 years, so 100 BC to 200 AD time frames also showing haplogroup X there. So yeah, like you said, when they found this X, and it's like, wait, this isn't East Asia, and then it's like, well, maybe it's since Columbus, and there's like,
nope.
No. Then they found it in skeletons that were clearly ancient,
and these skeletons, by the way, happen to be Hopewell mound builder skeletons.
Except for Kennewick Man, but who I think actually did connect to the Hopewell, but he's found in Washington State.
Yeah. So the Hopewell were primarily in the Midwestern part of the United States, what we call the Heartland. That's the reason we call this the Heartland model, because that's the best geographic description of that. But a lot of people are going, well, okay, so who are the Algonquins? Well, Algonquins actually is a language group, and they have about 110 tribes that are part of the Algonquin-speaking language groups. As you can see here, it includes like the Blackfoot and the Cheyenne and the Sioux out here in the western part of the United States. But most of these are up in the northeast. So the Mohicans, the Menominees, the Micmacs. The 2 I have bigger here is the Sac and the Fox and Ojibwe, because the Sac and the Fox are people that Joseph Smith specifically talked about. Okay, so you have the Potawatomis, the Shawnees, and the Wyandots, and the Yurok, and so forth. So these are some of the tribes.
Right.
But they're not the tribes out here in the West, like the Utes and the Paiutes and the people of Chaco Canyon. Those are like the
They have
Navajo.
a different language family.
Yeah, and those are actually
Yeah.
primarily Asiatic people.
Yeah, although there's evidence, there's clearly connections. So,
Yes. Yeah.
but yeah, in terms of the dominant DNA and the language families, it's different.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that is interesting that people bring up, especially those who are antagonistic to our faith, is the idea that, well, the Book of Mormon changed. There was the introduction page of the Book of Mormon. If you look in the introduction page, it originally said in the 1981 introduction, it says that that all were destroyed except the Lamanites, and they are the principal ancestors of Native Americans, or excuse me, of the American Indians. That was actually changed. Now, that introduction, by the way, was written by Bruce R. McConkie. It was never part of the original Book of Mormon, obviously.
Right.
This was written later on and added to the introduction to the Book of Mormon as an explanation. And then they have since they changed that back in 2007. On November 7th, there was the Deseret Morning News actually talked about the newly released introduction states, quote, all were destroyed except the Lamanites, and they are among the ancestors of the American Indians.
Yes.
So initially it had they were the principal ancestors, and now it just says they're among them.
Yeah, and I think this is a more safely
accurate.
correct statement.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's a more accurate statement for sure. Some people said, well, they changed that because of the DNA, and that may be partially true.
Yeah.
But they did change that to be more accurate to what is being found. So North, Central, and South America, most of the native peoples are Asiatic ancestry, except for this one small group up in the northeastern part of the United States, primarily. And we'll see that in just a couple minutes. Okay, now what about Central and South America? Because that's one of the things that people say, well, wait, but the Book of Mormon happened down there, right? And that's really the reason why the Heartland research has become such a powerful movement within the church, is because of the fact that people have been taught in CES for many years, really taught. That's where I was taught. The Central American theory was in seminary and institute and things. And also was even in the Book of Mormon missionary editions, where it had pictures of Machu Picchu and Chichen Itza and these other places in Central America. It kind of gave the impression that that's where it happened. But you'll notice that all that's been taken out.
Mm-hmm.
The church has taken all that stuff out, and that's a good thing. We're grateful that has happened, because we want to get back to what Joseph Smith knew and what he said.
I would say that for the Mesoamericans, their theory, because they've done research down there, and they see that they find Hebrew influence. But they don't really see a description that fits the Book of Mormon, and so they're hoping to still find something. I would say that they are correct that there's some Hebrew influence there, and actually in the book I'll get to with the autosomal DNA, where they do like the whole panorama of the DNA.
Yes.
They'll actually see just a little bit.
Yes.
They will see a little bit
that
doesn't fit Asian.
modern populations.
So I mean, for me, to me that seems more obvious. A later mixture or something that happened.
Yeah.
But in terms of from their perspective of a small amount of a DNA in the Mesoamerica, yes, that's what you do see. I think you do see a little bit of Hebrew influence, a little bit of Hebrew DNA that's throughout the Americas.
Yeah.
But
we're going to address that too,
Heartland
as well with the hinterland hypothesis information
yeah.
that we have. But let me just so this is in 2005. They said, well, the geneticists are looking now for haplogroup X DNA in other populations, and this is what they found in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology. They said, is haplogroup X present in extant South American Indians? And they did a total of 1,159 mitochondrial DNA samples from 25 South Native American populations that were surveyed for the mutations that are frequently found in haplogroup X, and they found, this is a direct quote, the results indicate that haplogroup X is not present in these samples. Up until now, among extant populations, X has only been found in North America. So that was back in 2005, and since that time they have found.
I think they've a little bit,
some,
but it's
yeah.
still clearly concentrated
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
in Northeast North America.
Yeah, and so this is actually a chart that shows the genetics of the history of Latin America, Hispanic American Historical Review. They talk about the ancient Mayas and contemporary Mayas have high concentrations of haplogroups A, a little bit of B, and a little bit of C.
Yeah.
Very little D, but 0 X.
Right.
And this was from back in a few years ago. So this is this actually though is I'm just trying to see this particular one is Evolutionary Anthropology in 2003 on mitochondrial DNA studies of Native Americans, conceptions and misconceptions of the population history of the Americas, and it says although haplogroup X is now accepted as a pre-Columbian Native American haplogroup, controversy still surrounds its origin.
Yeah.
How did it get here?
Right.
There's no explanation because it didn't come over the Bering Strait, which is how the Americas were thought to have been populated. So how did it get here, right? It says, while the other Native American haplogroups are found in Central East Asia, haplogroup X has not until quite recently been identified that far east, according to high frequencies, or occurring in high frequencies in Europe and Eastern and Western Asia. This has led to the hypothesis fueled by morphometric studies of the Kennewick Man remains in Washington State and other Paleo-Indian remains that there was a prehistoric migration of Europeans to the New World. So now they're finally starting to say, wait a minute, there must have been some other migration beyond or besides the one that came over the Bering Strait, which is really cool because this is again in 2002. They said due to the absence of haplogroup X in East Asia, which is presumed to be the homeland of the founders of Native Americans, this diverse hypotheses were proposed to explain the presence of this haplogroup in North America. But Brown et al. In 1998 suggested the possibility of an ancient European migration to North America, and Sanford in 1997 suggested that early Holocene Europeans used a transatlantic route to colonize the Americas. Transatlantic route.
Yeah.
So somebody had to cross the oceans.
Yeah, I would say so. As you found here, there are some strains where, and we'll get to them with. I have a couple of slides that I brought as well that will point to some of the findings here that show that haplogroup X came from the Middle East and so forth. But despite these strains, what you'll see is most of the mainstream scientists, because of that dominant paradigm.
Yes.
What they end up saying now, most of them, is that, well, even though we don't see X in Eastern Asia, still must have come through there.
Had to have come.
And even though, yes,
people didn't know how to build a ship back in those days.
And even though, yes, I guess it wasn't just one migration. It was probably multiple migrations, but there's probably still through Siberia. So they're still, in the mainstream science, they're still holding on to that paradigm.
Yeah, but what's interesting is, though, if you go away from the genetic side to the human migration side of things. So this is the Journal of Scientific Exploration in 2003. And it basically says pre-Columbian contact between the Americas. This is verifying what you're saying. This is actually in a journal article. It says pre-Columbian contact between the Americas and travelers from other continents and islands are highly probable, but the topic is taboo.
That's right.
In mainstream American archaeology. It says seagoing fishermen were in the North Atlantic in the first millennium BC and probably earlier, indicated by bones of deep-sea fish in coastal sites of northeastern America. But the probability of transoceanic contacts before Columbus is so high, one might say it is now a statistical certainty. In other words, the geneticists, they don't want to go there, but they have so much overwhelming evidence that there was, in fact, transatlantic contacts happening long before Columbus, that they're saying it's a statistical certainty of this. And this is actually in the Journal of Scientific Exploration.
Yeah.
So this is just kind of showing what's going on here. So this next little journal article was one that I had actually in my first DVD, but this is actually from the American Journal of Human Genetics. Okay, so this is a genetics article here in 2003. And what they found out was this haplogroup X, which is a primary group, could actually be subdivided into, or there were a portion of that had develop their own individual, what they call mutations. Now, when we say mutations, it's not like they're mutating into some kind of another animal. It's basically where the DNA, as it replicates, it misses something, or it adds or subtracts some part of the DNA, and it causes a little change, what they call a mutation from the original DNA strand. So that's what they're talking about here. It says first, haplogroup X variation is completely captured by two ancient clades. So there's only two subclades or subgroups of haplogroup X. Let's call it haplogroup 1 or X1 and X2. They said X1 is largely restricted to North and East Africa. So it's that another. And X2 is spread widely throughout Western Eurasia, which is basically the Middle East. Okay. Second, it's apparent that the Native American haplogroup X mitochondrial DNAs stem from the X2 by a unique combination of 5 mutations. So the Native American X2 is related to those of the Middle East, not the North Africans. Okay. And then it says,
and I'll just insert there.
Yeah.
So as you know, that for the Native Americans, they even further subdivided it. So primarily X2A, which is so in the X2, but there's also some X2G, and which is authentic ancient Native American ancestry.
Yeah.
But then the closest relative of that is X2J, which is one of those X2, and that's has been found in Egypt and in Iran.
Yeah, see, and those are new ones that were not available when I was doing my research. So this is some of the new stuff that you're getting here with David to bring this up. The third thing is we kind of addressed it just really quickly, and that is the third thing was the few Altean. That's the Altanes. That's the kind of Central and East Asia. Those DNAs that were found in 2001 by Dorenko et al. And Siberian haplogroup X lineages are not related to the Native American cluster. Okay, and they are more likely explained by recent gene flow from Europe or West Asia. So that's what they're talking about. Well, it must be from the recent one. And then they found out now that no, it's not from the recent one. There was here before Columbus. It's not recent admixture.
Yeah, I'd quibble with his words because they're related, but more like cousins. They're definitely not they're not the ancestor.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so basically you see here, this is the final couple of quotes here from this, and then we're going to wrap up this this particular episode here. But finally, the phylogeography of the subclades of haplogroup X suggests that the Near East, okay, that's Israel, is the likely geographical source population for the spread of subhaplogroup X2. The presence of a daughter clade in northern Native Americans testifies to the range of this population's expansion. So they're saying that they came basically from the Near East or the Middle East over to the Americans. And it is notable that X2 includes the 2 complete Native American X sequences. So so that is where I started to get really excited about this and go, my goodness.
You knew you were onto something big.
There was something happening here. I knew that. And what we're going to be talking about in our next episode is going to be going into what populations have the DNA type over in the old world, and then do they match up with the populations here in the new world, and then the big question that everybody has is, when did it get here? Yeah. At what time did it actually arrive here? Right. And we're going to go into a deep dive on the dating, because that's real important to understand. That you know, because when they arrived here, we know that Nephi in the Book of Mormon talked about it 600 BC. So anything before that would have had to have been before Lehi. But how was the dating done? And what can we learn from that? Right. So I want you to, if you can right now, go ahead and subscribe. We're gonna close this particular episode. So subscribe here below if you're loving this information and you want to learn more about it. If you want to be able to do a deep dive and explain to your family, your kids, your students, your friends, your neighbors, your coworkers about this DNA and the Book of Mormon, because that still comes up. I've talked to missionaries all over the world, and it still comes up all the time as missionaries are doing their missionary work and say, well, wait a minute, doesn't DNA disprove your Book of Mormon? Yeah, that's my goal. I'd love to help fortify people so that they know that they have a valid response that they can give to that, and that the DNA evidence actually is consistent with the Book of Mormon. And I think that's extremely valuable. And we'll look at their, You bet. All right. Thanks, David Reed. Appreciate you being here. So we're gonna so don't forget to subscribe, and then also just stay on board. And if you're following our playlist, and the next one we're coming up we'll be right there after that. Thanks everybody for taking your time.